It's great to have Chris Kluwe back on the show, NFL football player, lifelong gamer, back on the show after, I think it's been a couple years, Chris, since you were on.
Yeah, I want to say it was 2012 with the whole marriage amendment debate stuff in
Yeah,
Minnesota.
it was around that time, yeah. And you've been involved in a whole bunch of stuff since then. You've written science fiction, for one, and so many other things. You've been following GamerGate. You're both very much lauded and despised, seemingly, by different people. Let's kind of run back. I mean, there was a little while where you were not happy with some of the interviews we did related to GamerGate. But then after last week, then you said, hey, I'm actually interested in being back on the show. So, like, walk me through it. What did we do wrong first, like a few months ago?
Sure, yeah. So basically, in my perception, what I saw happening was the way that the show itself was slanted in terms of just the title of the show and kind of how that content was presented was, to me, it was one of those instances where you were proclaiming yourself to be neutral, but you could tell there was a definite slant. And I have examples here here are four show title episodes from October 28th through November 5th.
Let's do it.
And so one is GamerGate, Nero Milo investigating Brianna Wu restraining order. Okay, that's fairly neutral, right? You know, no positives, no negatives. It's establishing what happened.
Yep.
I believe in that episode it kind of gets into Milo's transphobia as well, but that's not in the title. That's something you have to actually watch. Then the next one is the 27th. GamerGate, Brianna Wu accuses interviewer of hit piece attack. And so, I watched both of those. And then the Brianna Wu one, the majority of the episode is an interview, and then it's only at the very end when you're kind of pressing her on stuff that she felt wasn't applicable to the conversation. But that's the impression that people get, especially when you post it to the GamerGate hashtag, is that, oh, now it's here's this anti-GamerGate person that's just going off the rails against this interviewer. How awful.
Right.
So kind of a slanted example. And then the other ones on November 5th. GamerGate, 8chan admin Hot Wheels denounces Brianna Wu doxing and harassment. Again, this makes it seem like Frederick Brennan is a sympathetic figure who, oh, this is horrible that this happened on my site. No mention of the child porn found on his site. No mention of the fact that he had established raid boards where people could actually do this stuff. And at the end of the interview, he essentially said, I'm not denouncing this as an 8chan admin. I'm denouncing this as Frederick Brennan.
Right.
And the title there says 8chan admin denounces doxing. So again, slanting things in a certain direction, and then contrast that to this is November 4th, so the day before. GamerGate, Arthur Chu angry with interviewer defends tactics. And then I believe the Twitter post for that one was, today's GamerGate interview with Arthur Chu will be up at 4 p.m. Eastern. He gets angry with me, but stands by doxing and tweet like not your shield. Now, without context, that makes it seem like Arthur Chu is in favor of everybody getting doxxed who doesn't agree with him, which, again, if you watch the interview, he makes it very clear, no, that he was talking about a very specific portion of the internet, people who are using illegal RAT tactics to try and hack into people's webcams and essentially blackmail them. But to the person who sees your tweet, they're like, oh, that Arthur Chu's a horrible person. Why would we listen to him?
So it sounds like your issue was not so much with the way the interviews were conducted necessarily, nor with the format of the interviews, but it was that you determined that the titles for the interviews seemed to be slanted in a way to make the so-called anti-GamerGaters look bad or off the rails, as you said, and were much more neutral, so to speak, with regard to the pro-GamerGaters. Am I sort of summing it up the way you're saying it?
Yeah, and I think it is. I mean, I'm a fan of the stuff you've talked about. The stuff where you talk about in terms of like corruption, the corrosive influence of money and going for clicks in our media, and how our political system's broken, and we're in this endless war that we need to figure out a way to stop. So that's why, to me, it was very disappointing to see the fact that this is essentially clickbait. This is to get people to come look at the episodes because it's a hot topic. It's something that people are passionate and are willing to talk about. And I felt that you can proclaim that you're neutral, but if your actions show something different, then that's not something that I'm comfortable with, and I don't think it's something that you yourself would be comfortable with based on your past actions.
Yeah, I mean, your criticisms are perfectly fair in the sense that they're both specific, based in fact, and you're not going about it from an ad hominem point of view. So how can I be angry at these criticisms? These are all perfectly fair criticisms. From our point of view, we never sort of proclaimed so-called neutrality. And I use that term because I think that there's a difference between being politically neutral with regard to everything we discuss and being neutral in the sense that we're not advocating on the pro or anti-Gamergate side. So I think that this so-called neutrality, which, by the way, those who called us neutral, those claims have evaporated over the last 72 hours, as I'm sure you saw and as we'll discuss, and we'll get to that. But when we talked about neutrality, what I meant was gaming is not my main thing, and we're covering this more because our audience has said, hey, you cover like hundreds of different topics. Here's a topic you should cover and we'd be interested in hearing about. With gay marriage, we're not neutral, right? Mm-hmm. There are two sides, and we're very much on one side and against the other side, and it's abundantly clear politically which side we're on. With regard to Gamergate, I find myself to be neutral in that I'm willing to kind of listen to both sides. I'm not advocating on behalf of either side, and I'm willing to ask the hardest questions I can think of to both sides. But I think that maybe even the saying we are so-called neutral is something that became a sort of vicious circle of confusion.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the problem too is that on the side of people who, and it's not even really a side, it's of the people who oppose Gamergate, a lot of us, the reason we do so is because we are intimately familiar with that online culture, with, Chan culture and what kind of behavior it can lead to. And that's why we were so vehemently opposed to it, because we're essentially experts in this field. We grew up on Something Awful, on Fark.com, on 4chan, with these message boards, knowing the types of behaviors that happen on those message boards. And so when we see this happening and starting to leak out into real life, where now it's really affecting people in real life. I mean, we're talking about, doxings, we're talking about swattings now. We're talking about the government is starting to get involved, which is a horrible thing, because the majority of people in Congress have no idea what the internet is like. And when they hear stuff about this, they're like, oh crap, we need to stop it. How can we overregulate this so it never happens again? And that to me is the huge issue that a lot of people in Gamergate are missing, is that in their rush to have their temper tantrum and have their, so-called freedom of speech, they don't recognize that they're undermining the entire structure that allows that to exist. And that's why I speak out against it, because again, none of us are saying that there's a problem with ethics in journalism. That's a perfectly valid complaint to have.
You mean none of you are saying that there is not a problem with that, right? You're admitting that that is a problem.
Oh, yeah. No, we're saying if you have a problem with ethics in game journalism, that is a perfectly fine position to have. You can have that position. We will not oppose that. I mean, me personally, I agree. There are problems with ethics in game journalism. I think you should go after the developers first, because they're the ones who cause it, rather than the indie game studios and the game journalists themselves, because they're just reacting to what's being provided to them. But that's a whole separate argument. But the thing is that if you have that view that ethics in game journalism is somehow broken and needs to be fixed, okay, great, you have our support. If you then bring about the same view along with, we're going to harass these people endlessly because we feel that they're somehow connected to that, that's where the problems come into play, because now you're no longer going about the end goals that you want in a way that is conducive to a long-lasting society. It's super harmful.
So you mentioned one thing that I want to get to, which is the disconnect between legislators and knowing how the internet is actually used, because that's something we've been talking about for a while. But before we get to that, to kind of finish with an analysis of your critique, the last thing I want to mention is, interestingly enough, you kind of came away with the idea that our slant was actually pro-Gamergate, right? I mean, that's based on the titles you read. Your impression was we were having kind of like a pro-Gamergate bias.
And not necessarily even a pro-Gamergate bias. It was the fact that you were allowing them a platform on which they could disseminate harmful information, when any look at the factual background indicates that this, Gamergate as is a hate movement that was founded for the specific goal of disrupting Zoe Quinn's life, and then later expanded to include several other people, primarily women, which again really reveals kind of the misogynistic core at Gamergate's heart. And
so that's truly you have a very clear, like, sometimes I'll speak to people about this and they say, Well, listen, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, and then there are misogynistic elements and there are harassing elements, but they won't be as clear as you're being now that you just believe this is a hate movement.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's completely a hate movement because the Gamergate hashtag itself, people choose to associate themselves with that. If they want to have ethics in video game journalism, they can create an entirely different hashtag. They can create an entirely different movement where you actually have physical meetups, and that's something I told them back in October. I actually did a AMA Ask Me Anything on the Kotaku in Action subreddit.
Yep.
And one of the things I repeated over and over and over again was the fact that as your movement is now, you will not succeed because you will lose the PR war. You have no way to hold anyone accountable for their actions. And if you truly want this to be a movement about ethics in video game journalism, you have to have a way to hold people accountable. Otherwise, the same stuff is just going to keep happening over and over and over again because you provide plausible deniability to those who want to do it. And everyone was like, well, no, we don't want to do that. Our strength is in, our anonymity. I'm like, well, then that's what's going to happen. And you have no one to blame but yourselves. It's your choice to do this. It's your choice to be involved with Gamergate. The rest of us are just reacting to what Gamergate is doing.
Let's skip forward to this past weekend where the tweet that led to this interview was you saying, hey, after that interview with Vox Day, you'd be glad to be back on. What happened in that interview? In other words, my view going in was the process was identical to all of them. I research the person, I research what they've said and done, and then I do the interview and we kind of put it up. But something changed in your perception after that interview?
Well, I think it's becoming more and more blatantly obvious that Gamergate attracts the kind of person that is Vox Day. There's a reason that Vox Day wants to be a part of Gamergate. There's a reason Stormfront wants to be a part of Gamergate. Why the neo-reactionary movement wants to be a part of Gamergate. Why Breitbart wants to have Gamergaters reading their site. It's because they see it as a very fertile breeding ground for them to sort of inoculate a new generation of teens and young adults into their way of thinking, and which is really funny because Gamergate is always about it's not politics, we just want video games, but you look at it and there's all these political voices clustering to Gamergate that really want Gamergaters to kind of buy into their philosophies, and so when you can reveal someone like Vox Day's sort of internal process of just how Vox Day came about being Vox Day, then to me that's like, okay, you really are kind of figuring out that, hey, maybe this movement isn't everything that they say they are, and it's not something that we should be looking at, and also the title too, whereas actually something that it was like, okay, here is the meat of what happened with Vox Day, whereas like I said before, those titles were something that were being applied solely to those who were on the anti-Gamergate side, so to speak.
Yeah, and so to push back against that kind of specific thing, I completely understand from your point of view how it would kind of come off that way. From our point of view, given that we were not trying to take a pro or anti-Gamergate position, our thing was, what's the best title here that is factual and it relates to something that was said in the interview that even if it doesn't encompass the majority of the interview is both accurate and interesting. And I completely agree with you that in those 4 examples that you cite, it did happen that the two kind of anti-Gamergaters that ended up having some adversarial moments, which we did choose and pull out. It was a conscious decision that was interesting and that would attract attention. And I think that if you were to look at, I think we did some more like 10 interviews, you talked about 4, the skewing that you identify would sort of go away if we were to analyze all of the titles. But that being said, based on the data you presented, I don't disagree with how you might come away with that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so and here's my other part that I'm really sort of curious on is that how do you look at the factual information about the rise of Gamergate, that started with the Aaron Gajoni post, morphed into Five Guys, which then morphed into Gamergate once Adam Baldwin saw the YouTube video. How do you look at that factual information, including the IRC chat logs that Zoe Quinn herself, got from where they were plotting against her?
Right, and it's been months since I looked at those chat logs, just to make it clear.
Right. Yeah. No. And so there's all this stuff laid out. It is a very visible course of events how this morphed from hate group into hate group into hate group, and how then do you remain neutral, I guess, is my main question.
There's kind of 2 answers, I guess, to that. One is I think that to truly take a position on something where I say, hey, you know what? I'm throwing in with the anti-GamerGaters, or I'm throwing in with the pro-GamerGaters. I want to have a level of familiarity with all of the data that I would not be able to do my show if I were to fully commit myself to reading absolutely everything. And every day I'm flooded with so much stuff. So given that I want to, for example, when it comes to media consolidation and media bias in political reporting, I feel really strongly that I'm kind of all over that, right? I'm always researching that. I've built probably at this point 8 or 10 years of research into kind of like my current understanding of that. So my level of comfort in saying, hey, you know what? This is just absolutely the way it is. And if you disagree, not only are you wrong, you're probably deliberately being deceptive on purpose here. With Gamergate and with many other issues, right? I just don't have that level of familiarity with all of the minutia. So the relationship that I have to those interviews is, let's research as much as possible about the individual and their claims and see what we can kind of suss out about what they've said and about whether the specifics of what they said are sort of accurate or not. That's kind of where our show is on Gamergate, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. And again, that gets back to my my idea that the people you've had on are essentially experts in this field. This is a world that they have lived in. And so when they give you their expert opinion and you still don't, you don't take it as an expert opinion when you say, well, that's just your individual viewpoint, or that's that. Do you see how that comes across as essentially the same way if someone was questioning you on your ability to report on political events?
I do and I don't, because the people I've had on, there are some that certainly you would look at them as anti-Gamergate Chris Kluwe, and you would say, these three people, you should actually, I don't consider them experts, and you shouldn't consider them experts, and you shouldn't buy into what they're saying, even though they would describe themselves as experts. And there are others who you would say, David, you should, there's really no debate here, right? These three people, they're just right. And they happen to agree with me, sure, but they're just objectively right about this. So even that, I think, is tinged with a sort of bias or partiality, because even not everybody I interviewed, all of whom would describe themselves as experts, would you agree are actually experts I should be listening to, right?
Well, it really depends. It depends on their chosen field and what you asked them about. So, for example, in the Brianna Wu's interview, when you're asking her about, hey, what is this, what is this harassment? What is this about? And she's answering and she's telling you and she's describing it, and then you don't brush it off, but it's almost like it gets pushed to the side in favor of well, what about this when you said that? And it gave the definite feel that you were attacking her credibility, as opposed to saying, okay, you are more knowledgeable in this field than I am, why would you attack her credibility when...
Yeah, but the questions I was asking were not really questions that were questioning her credibility as a game developer, right? I mean, and even with the harassment stuff, I don't know how long it's been since you reviewed that interview. I looked at it pretty recently. The questions I had for her were more just kind of like, I've been on the receiving end of harassment. And when I talk to authorities, they tell me not to publicize it. So I'm kind of genuinely curious what made you decide to publicize it. I didn't actually question whether the harassment happened. We talk about victim blaming and the kind of stigma around reporting harassment and sexual assault a lot. I have a pretty firm understanding of that part. I was just more genuinely curious. You decided to be very public about the specific nature of the harassment, whereas I play like hate mail. But if I get something that I seriously consider a threat, I forward it to the authorities and follow their advice not to talk about it. So I don't think that's questioning her credibility as a developer.
Well, so part of it that I see, though, is the fact that you don't know the specific circumstances of what the authorities told her. And as we're seeing more and more, especially with Randy Harper's swatting and with Zoe Quinn's case, with all the threats that she's received, the authorities have said, it's fine to talk about this stuff. You can totally talk about this stuff. And so I think it's one of those cases where as human beings ourselves, we have to resist the urge to have our own personal anecdotes substitute for, other people's experiences, and thinking that our own personal anecdotes are the norm when they may not be.
No, and I guess that's kind of what I was trying to ascertain, right? Which is, hey, I don't know the rule about what to do. This is kind of what I've been told. What's your story about it? And kind of providing a platform. But all of these criticisms are perfectly fair, and you're not bomb throwing. And I think it's great to talk about these. So I'm fine with that. I do want to ask about a couple of other things.
Sure.
One is, so this disconnect that you mentioned between the laws around the internet and the legislators making those laws. Around the Hillary Clinton non-email scandal, Lindsey Graham went on TV, and in criticizing and bomb throwing about what Hillary Clinton had done, he admitted he had never even sent an email, right? And that was like a huge red flag. How is someone who's on the Surveillance and Tech Committee, or what, I forget the name of the committee, he's never sent an email. Email's been around since he's been in his mid-30s, and he's making laws around email.
Right.
Hugely disturbing. New York child porn. There was a point at which someone could not be convicted of child porn because they had right-click and saved as the pictures without actually viewing them. And as the law was written, that didn't actually count as viewing child porn or whatever. Do you think that with video games, there's this kind of similar disconnect that's going on between the pragmatic realities of video gaming and the laws surrounding video games and online, massive multiplayer online games, etc.?
Yeah, and I think it's not even so much video games as it is internet culture as a whole, where you have kids these days growing up in households that have computers. It's no longer having a computer is something that you either have to be super rich or your dad or mom has to be the super geek that somehow has the hookup. It's everyone has an iPad now or a Dell or a laptop or something. You have a way to connect to the internet, and so what we're seeing is that we're seeing this entire generation growing up who are adopting the norms of the previous generation, and the previous norms were like Usenet groups and BBS boards, and essentially the more geeky, nerd-oriented types of people who, when they would prank each other, it was, oh, I'm going to make your computer disk drive go in and out to mess with you, as opposed to, I'm calling a SWAT team in on your location because you blew up my Minecraft server. I mean, and really the sad reality is that it's going to continue to get worse and worse and worse because video games are a huge entry point to that stuff. You have almost every single game these days can be played online. So you're interacting with other people, you're interacting in an online environment. And the way our current judicial system is set up is that we have laws to protect against this kind of stuff. There are laws on the book that prevent cyber stalking, that prevent online harassment, but the issue you run into is that local police forces don't have the resources to pursue something like that. They don't have the resources to say, okay, someone who's harassing you maybe 3 states over, we're going to track down their IP address and then go arrest them. They can't do that. They're worried on their local community. The FBI has the resources to do that, but they're concerned with there are, bomb threats coming in from for the president's visit to Utah or Idaho or something like that. That's what we're dealing with. Or maybe they're just setting up their own terror cells so then they can convict people and get some arrests. They've been known to do that too.
Entrapment, sure, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But the issue is there's this gray area in between where this online harassment we're seeing this driving out of people from a space that they need it to be safe. It falls in that gray area where it's above the local authorities' resources, but it's below the level to catch the FBI's attention. And until we deal with that gray area is still going to continue to exist, and people are still going to continue to exploit it because they know they can.
And I've dealt with this. I mean, we've gotten threats, somewhat specific threats that come from a Skype number, right? When you Google the number, it's just a generic number that shows up when you call somebody from Skype. And we don't know where the person is located. And when we had kind of like a white hat hacker look into it a little bit, they said, yeah, they're kind of running through an Indian IP address. It's abundantly clear that this person is not Indian based on their perfect kind of American dialect accent. The local police where we're physically located say, we don't know where these people are. Why would this be a local police issue? FBI says we get involved when it crosses state lines. We don't know that it crosses state lines. And essentially nobody can do, or at least is willing to do anything about it. But how can you remedy that?
Yeah. Well, there's 2 ways. And one of them is that we figure out how to police ourselves. As a community, we figure out, okay, these are issues that are happening online. We need to make a conscious choice to say that this behavior is harmful and destructive and that we're not going to tolerate it. And there is something to be said about freedom of speech. People need to have spaces where they can say things that they wouldn't otherwise normally say, that they can be someone that they wouldn't otherwise normally be. I mean, that's true just as much for, say, a teenager or someone in high school trying to discover their identity as it is for a whistleblower at a major corporation who needs to not be identified. But the problem is that if we don't make the conscious choice to identify these spaces, if we don't make the conscious choice to say, okay, what is acceptable on 8chan is not acceptable on the rest of the net, and you shouldn't be doing that because it leads to serious harm to people, then the government's not going to have any choice but to get involved, because it will start to affect more and more people. And you'll probably see the creation of something like a cyber police force, or a cyber division of the FBI that's at a lower level than, say, like the national FBI offices. That it's more kind of regional, local, but it's at a higher level than local police. And then the problem you get into is that, okay, now you're creating more government apparatus with the potential to be abused. And if history shows us anything, it's that when you create these apparatuses, 9 times out of 10, actually 10 times out of 10, they're going to be abused. And I would very much prefer to avoid that, because we really do need anonymity on the internet. Like it's a really important thing, but there are a lot of people right now who are trying to screw it over for everyone else, and they just don't understand the consequences of what they're doing.
Last thing in the couple minutes we have left, you talked about how esports is a burgeoning culture of actual sports. Every time we talk about our video games, sports, it's like a huge debate that blows up. You actually played professional football, which I've never heard anyone deny is actually a sport. So how do
they'll call me a punter, so.
how do you determine what a sport is, and why are video games part of that?
I think in order for something to be a sport, there has to be a physical component involved. It has to be something that you can't really just get off the couch and do well. You have to put in a certain amount of hours practicing it in order to be good at it. So, for example, golf is considered a sport. Golfers aren't running a 4.340. Golfers generally aren't bench pressing like 400 pounds. But everyone agrees that golf is a sport, because it's a series of motions that you have to practice. You have to build muscle memory in order to become the very best at it. And to me, esports is exactly the same way, because you need to have the muscle memory and also the physical capabilities required in order to react to what's happening on the screen, in order to input the correct amount of commands and have them go to the correct place. Like, you see these StarCraft players where they're putting in, I think it's like 100 or 120 commands per minute, which is insane. Like, they're clicking all over the map, and they're sending units everywhere, and they're doing stuff that if you had normal Joe Average get up off the couch and try and do that, they're not going to be able to do it. So on that first case, in terms of actual physical activity, I believe that esports, yes, definitely qualifies as a sport. Secondly, I think that the vast majority of sports also reward teamwork. I mean, yeah, you have your solo sports. You have, like I said, golf. You have bowling, tennis, stuff like that. But most of the sports we consider sports are stuff like soccer, like hockey, like football, like baseball. Those are all things where a team, yes, and basketball, thank you. Those are all things where a team has to work together and trust each other in order to achieve victory. And when you see games like League of Legends, when you see games like Heroes of the Storm or Dota 2, or even Counter-Strike, where you have a team going after an objective or against another team, it is fully dependent on that team cooperating with each other and learning how to cooperate with each other in order for them to secure victory. And so it's not just 5 people sitting down and playing a game once a week. We're practicing 8 to 9 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, and then also playing a game. So, I mean, in my mind, esports is just as valid a sport as sports that we traditionally consider, physical sports out in the real world.
All right, well, he said it all. We've been speaking with Chris Kluwe, NFL football player, played 8 seasons with the Minnesota Vikings, and lifelong gamer. Thanks for being on, Chris. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on. And remember, it's, examine the facts.